Well, praise the Lord, everybody. Are we ready to sing the Hebrew alphabet? We ready to sing it? You listen to the YouTube video that I posted. We're all ready to sing. Aleph, Bet, and Gimel, right? We're ready? We're ready? Okay. Well, you have the video there. We'll practice it. Not today, but I'd love to be able to sing that as one big chorale so we can learn our Hebrew alphabet. I think it would be helpful. So with this series, we're going to be taking a deep dive into trying my best to help you folks out with reading and understanding the Bible. And I thought that what would be helpful to that end would be unpacking some of the original language. I think that would be very helpful. And so what I'm going to do is there's some really technical grammatical points that we could talk about, and well, I won't do that. And so what I'm going to do is I'll start each week with about 10 minutes or so covering a couple things concerning the Hebrew, and then I'll hop into the lesson proper. So for today, if you can open the Slack, if you don't have it, look to your neighbor next to you, if they might have it, and open up the alphabet, and we're going to go over the alphabet. So our first Hebrew lesson is learning some of the letters here. The Hebrew alphabet has 22 letters, so we have 26. They have 4 less than us, and so that should make it a little bit easier, right? And normally, if you're teaching a class on Hebrew, you would talk about, well, there's Semitic languages, and here's all the related languages, like Akkadian and Ugaritic and Arabic and Aramaic and all those different things. We're far too pressed for time for something like that. And so I want to direct your attention to the little document that I sent. What you have on the far right, so Hebrew is written right to left, right? So it's a different direction than how ours is written here. And what you have on the far left is based off the Paleo-Hebrew. If you go way back, maybe 2,500, 3,000 years ago, the Hebrew script was something called Paleo-Hebrew, and each letter had a meaning. And so if you were to look at the original, right? So if you look at the document, the word Aleph in the Hebrew, the Paleo-Hebrew, it looked a little bit more like this. It was an ox head, but it meant Aleph, is what some of these letters look like. And so I'm not going to go through the Paleo-Hebrew. That's not important. Just so you know what that category is. There's the one that says sound, so it lets you know the pronunciation, and then the column with name lets you know the letter's name. So like there's the W is called W, but it has the W sound. So I'm just going to read through these very quickly so you can know how to pronounce the different names. And then I really want us to be able to sing the song together. So the song is 45 seconds long. Not tonight, but be listening to it, and we'll give it a shot. It is a quick song. It's quick, pretty fast. So you got to really get this down. So starting the very top right, that's pronounced Aleph. Aleph is how that's pronounced. No sound. It makes no sound. The next one is bait. Now, what's interesting, well, I won't go there. We'll save it for a future lesson. We'll talk about our begat kafat letters, which is a whole other thing. But for now, we'll just call it bait. Makes the b, or sometimes it makes the v sound. B or v, depending on some notation, but we can talk about that. Then there's gimel, is the g sound, gimel, g. Then there's dalit, it's the d sound. Then there's hey, or h sound, huh. Then we have vav. It's vav in modern Hebrew, but in biblical Hebrew it's pronounced wow. I'm going to pronounce it with the modern Hebrew because to read biblical Hebrew is much more challenging for my brain. And so so for example, his name is not David, it's actually Dawid, is how it would be pronounced. The word for iniquity is avon, is actually pronounced awon. And so there's a couple of words that impacts, but that's the classical pronunciation. Then the next one is Zion. Zion is our Z sound. This is our first fun one. That one, you gotta get the back of the throat. It's a guttural pronunciation. It's an H, but it's a hard H. It's pronounced chet. You gotta practice that sound. Chet. It's like you use it sometimes in English, like Bach, right? Bach. Here. So chet. And then we have the T sound is tet. Then we have the Y is yod. Then we have our K sound, which is cough. L is lamed. Mem is our M sound. Mem. Then our N sound is nun. It's not none. It's pronounced noon. That's see the 8 with the dot under it. It lets you know it's the again. So that's pronounced samech. Most people just say samek is how most people pronounce it. It's another S sound. They have multiple S sounds and multiple T sounds. They have repetitions. Then there's ayin is weird because technically the actual sound for ayin is opening and closing your throat, and that's the sound that you're supposed to make. Like we pronounce it Gamora is Gamora. Gamora is how you're supposed to pronounce it, but we're just going to say ayin is not pronounced. Modern, okay? Then we have pay. That's the P sound. This one's another one. It's a T-Z sound. Like it's the RTS sound, like the book of Acts. So it's sade, sade, sade. It's like a TS together, sade. Then some people say K sound, some people say Q, but that's kof. Then we have the R is for the resh sound. This word is confusing. Depending on where the dot is, the sheen is either sheen or seen. Depends on where the dot is. We'll talk about that when we get into particulars. And the final one is tav, right? And so that's the alphabet. I'll read it one more time. Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, He, Vav, Zayin, Chet, Tet, Yod, Kaf, Lamed, Mem, Nun, Samek, Ayin, Pei, Sade, Kof, Resh, Sheen, and Teen. Well, Tav, excuse me. Sheen, Seen, and Tav. Okay. I'm going to play the video for us because I really want you all to hear it. And you got to hear the cadence. You'll be able to say it full speed with practice. It took me weeks, but we have it. Doesn't sound fast, but it is. Aleph, Bet, and Gimel, Dalet, He, and Vav, and Zayin. Chet, and Tet, and Yod, and Kaf, and Lamed, Mem, Samek, Ayin, Pei, and Sade, Kof, and Resh, Sin, and Sheen, and Tav, Habeinu, Shalom, Shalom, Shalom Alechem. Right? There we go. So no, you all have it, so you can practice it, and we're gonna, so because next Wednesday we won't be here, but we'll be here the following Wednesday, so you have 2 weeks. We're gonna sing it together as a family, so listen to it thousands and thousands of times, and you'll eventually be able to get it. Yes? No, sheen and seen, but they do say both, yes. Chaveinu, and then they have it in the description, the ending is Chaveinu, Shalom, Shalom, Shalom Alachem, but it's there in the comments, so you know how to pronounce it. But we'll yes. It's not pronounced. So like Aleph and Ayin, they don't have a sound. So which we don't have here in this paper, is we don't have any of the vowels. So it only takes on the sound of the vowels. So if you want to make a sound, you'll have to have a comets. And so you see the comets. Like this T is a comets, is what that is. So let's say we have this word here. That's an Aleph. Aleph isn't pronounced, but we know that's the A sound. So that's, and the way you read Hebrew is down. So you start up here, then you go down, you go corner, down, corner. So that's how you read Hebrew. So that's Dalet. What sound does a Dalet make? And you don't learn about that's Mem Sofit, which is when 5 of the letters, when they're in the final place of the word, they change their form. So it's called the Mem Sofit. So that's the Mem. So that's Aleph, Dalet, and Mem. Adam. Adam. Right? Adam. And so This is the aleph again. This is a weird one because you think that's the vav, but because it has this dot over it, that's called a holum. And because there's a holum, the vav isn't pronounced. It's actually a vowel. But we haven't gotten the vowels yet. So this is pronounced or. Or. That means light. So Adam means humanity. Or means light. This is a long one. Elohim. Because remember, the aleph isn't pronounced. That's a sere. So it's actually specific type of sere. We won't go that. So that's the L, remember? Then there's a dot next to it there, so that's the L-O. Lo, that's a hirik, makes the E sound. Elohim. And so that's how we get Elohim. So that means spiritual beings is the best interpretation. This is the S, right? And the dot is on the right side. So it makes it sh and not s. Remember, that's the A. So shamayim. Shamayim. Heavens, skies. And then this is eretz. That's the side A when it's in the final position. It's the TS sound. That's the R. That's the aleph. And those are vowels, which we'll talk about next time. So once you have the vowels, this will get a lot easier. But that's eretz. So you have 5 words. This is land, like the land. So you have humanity, light, spiritual beings, heavens or skies, either is fine, and land. Adam, Or, Elohim, Shemaim, Eretz. There we go. So that's my vocab for today. I'll put the answers so you can take a picture because you need the vocab. So I'm going to quiz you on the alphabet and the vocab next week, in 2 weeks. You have 2 weeks to learn 5 words. That's easy. I learn 25 a week. So this will be easy. Humanity. Light. I'm thinking in Hebrew. Let's find it. Okay. So you can just take a picture of those, and then you'll have that for your reference. Hello. Right to left. Yeah. So like, if I want to write Adam, the way I would write it is, there's like a technique you have to learn. When they're teaching you Hebrew, there's boxes. Those are really bad boxes. You have boxes, and then you fill in the box. So the aleph is corner to corner, then like that. And dalet is all the way across the top. Then there's a lip, and then mem is the whole box. So there's a whole process, but we'll devote a class to writing it. So it's a process. We'll get there in due course. Okay, that's our little bit of spiel on the Hebrew for today. We'll spend like I said, we'll start each time with a little bit of time, and the goal is to build some of your basic Hebrew. I want to pick words that are prevalent and that you're going to see a lot. And so these are ones that we're going to encounter often, and so you want to be starting to get your familiarity with some of these. Okay, with that fun part out of the way, let us get started. So we're going to begin a teaching series on the Bible. My aim is to equip us with the ability to read the Bible effectively. As I said Tuesday night, I'm taking off my pastor hat and I'm putting on the teacher hat. I'm not going into doctrine. That's not what I'm teaching. I'm teaching you how to read the Bible. And that's it. I'm not teaching you application. I'm just teaching you how to read the text. So I'm strictly, I don't have like momentum to my lesson. I don't have like a zinger for an opening and a call to, it's none of those things. I'm not appealing you to do anything. I'm just teaching. So I am fully having the teacher hat on, no application. Okay. So the Bible is an interesting book in a sense that it's a miniature library of Jewish writings, and it spans a couple thousand years. It's composed by 40 different authors who lived and had various occupations. They lived in different political circumstances, right? Like the writer, the time of kings, there's a divided monarchy, but you could say Ezra, they're coming back from exile, or you can say in parts of Egypt they're living in Rome, and in parts of Exodus they're in Egypt and they're enslaved, or in Genesis they don't have a home yet, or in Numbers they're traveling through. So they're living in different circumstances. You have to keep that in mind as you're reading through it. And these writers lived in drastically different situations, and that had an impact on their writing. And not only that, a lot of these writers weren't in communication one to another. And so we have all these books that were compiled together by people who never met and talked. Yet when you read the book, it forms one clear message. From Genesis to Revelation, we see a unified story. And I think that's gone there. Okay. If that's not going to be fixed, we can just turn TV off. Otherwise, it's distracting. An analogy that I like to use when describing the Bible is that it's a mosaic. So mosaic is a picture or a pattern produced by arranging together smaller pieces. So you've learned about those in school. So you take 1,000 different squares of different shades, you put them together, and they make a picture. You zoom up on any individual square, and there's nothing there. But when you step back, you see this big, beautiful picture. The Bible's still a mosaic, but in an interesting way. And I have an example here. The Bible is composed of thousands of self-contained literary units that they themselves tell a story, and you can get meaning and value from those units. But when you put those units together and you step back, there's another portrait that's painted. An example that I like to use is, if you look at the picture in the notes, it's a picture of Muhammad Ali. But it's a picture that is comprised of other pictures. Do you see the picture? Do you have it? Yes, right? So it's a picture. So you could zoom in if you wanted, and these are snapshots from different moments of his life, and each of those pictures tell a story. And so you could take just one picture and tell this fantastic story based off one little picture. And that's what preaching is. Preaching is, I took this one piece of this giant quilt, and I'm going to tell you, and it's good, and it ministers to people, and that's wonderful. But these pieces do at times need to be meshed together so we can see the whole picture. And so I guess that leads to the question then, when you think about this portrait, this mosaic of Muhammad Ali, there was somebody who arranged these pictures and put them together so it can take a specific shape. From that, we can draw this. The Bible has a specific shape. And today we're going to focus just on the Old Testament. So it will be just on the Old Testament. I've said this dozens of times. Do we know the shape of the Old Testament? Do you know or I'll put it like this. Do we know the major divisions of the Old Testament? Yes, you said the Tanakh. Right. And so we had a brave person say the Tanakh. And so that's spelled like this, T-A-N-A. So we'll highlight the T and the K. What does Tanakh stand for? Man, we were reading those notes great, huh? There we go. Right? So we have the Tanakh. The Tanakh is an acronym that's used to refer to the Old Testament. And so before we hop into that, I don't want us to get the perception that this orientation is completely random, because it certainly isn't. There's a quote that I have here. is that it's helpful for Christians to look at the Bible, specifically the Bible of their founders. So Jesus is the founder of Christianity. And what Bible did Jesus read? Well, he read the Old Testament. And too often Christians have let the New Testament dominate the interpretation of the Old Testament without first trying to engage the latter in a meaningful way. If we're going to read the Old Testament well, we have to let it speak on its own terms. Is Jesus in the Old Testament? Or could you say that the Old Testament points to Jesus? Absolutely. But before it points to Jesus, it has a meaning in and of itself. And in fact, the Old Testament is supposed to shape our basic theological categories that we then carry over to the New Testament. Far too many believers, people coming to faith, what do they read first? Normally one of the Gospels. If you're a new Christian, you're going to read the Gospel first. To me, that's a fool's errand. You are instilling bad Bible habits. Because you're coming to Matthew or Luke, but you have no idea of the context that got you there. I love to use this example when I'm teaching people how to read the Bible. Candace and Lavisha have been in this class with me, so you guys can't spoil the answer. So, okay, I'll talk to Crystal. I'm talking to Crystal, and you are reading a message. My message is being delivered to somebody named Tia. I'm delivering the message to them. And my message is, don't let Simone step on the grate. I'm speaking in modern English. There's no cultural barriers. In theory, you should be able to understand what I just said. You lack the context. You don't know who Tia is. But if you knew who Tia is, that would help you understand lots of things. Tia is one of my babysitters. Who did she babysit? Elizabeth. And so, who's Simone? You could guess that's Elizabeth's middle name, Simone. What is the grate? Well, if you knew that she was Elizabeth's babysitter, you would knew that it was at my previous house. My previous house, if you've ever been, you would have to have gone to my house, was built in the 40s. And there's a floor furnace. It got really hot. So there's a giant metal grate on the floor. And it got really hot. So unless you had all that context, you have no idea what's happening. Same thing happens when you open up, let's say, the Gospel of John. And you read John 1 and 14, and it says that the Word dwelt among us. If you've not read the Old Testament and all you have is this, you just see that the Word dwelt among us, you're missing all the context. That is a Greek word that's translating a Hebrew word, shakan, which means to dwell, which if you take that word dwell and turn it to a noun, which becomes mishkan, is the word for tent, the tabernacle. The tabernacle where God met the people. The verb version of that word is what the Greek writers use to describe God manifesting in flesh. Jesus is the tabernacle among us today. But if you don't have the context of the Old Testament, you wouldn't get any of that. And that's only the first chapter of John. How are we going to get the rest of it? We need context. This is why it's important that we start with the Old Testament and we understand it. There's a scholar, Bonhoeffer, and there's advice that he gives. He says, I don't think it is Christian to want to get into the New Testament too soon or too directly. And us, as Oneness Pentecostal people, I think one of the grave consequences that comes from starting with the New Testament and not allowing the Old Testament to build the foundation is that you get an improper understanding of the nature of God. Just for example. Let's look at Luke 24. Luke 24. This is Jesus. He's a resurrected Jesus. He's already in his glorified body, and he's talking to his disciples, and he says this, Luke 24. starting at verse 44. He says, "Now he said to them, 'These are my words, which I spoke to you while I was still with you, that all the things which are written about me in the law,'" Torah, right? The law of Moses, the prophets, Nevi'im, right? And the Psalms, the Kecoughtan, the very first book of the Kecoughtan is the book of Psalms. That order, it was not arbitrary. He opened their minds to understand the scriptures, and he said to them, "Thus it is written that Christ would suffer and rise again from the dead, and by the third day, and that repentance and forgiveness of sins will be proclaimed in his name to all nations, beginning at Jerusalem." First, notice how the Old Testament was described by Jesus. It was using this very same arrangement, Tanakh, Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim. This is how he understood. So by time the first century, that's the shape that the Old Testament had already taken. And so we all know the Torah, and those first 5 books, we got those ones, right? So we know Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. So that's easy. What's interesting, and this blows, when I first realized this really just opened my mind. Here are the books that are considered prophets. It's in the notes, but I'm going to read it anyway. It's Joshua is in the prophets. That's a very different way of reading the Bible. Joshua, Judges, Samuel, it's one book in Hebrew, but we call it 1st and 2nd Samuel. Same thing with Kings. Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Isaiah, and we call them the minor prophets. They call them the 12. That's what they're called. It's all one scroll. It's the 12. And then the writings, the Ketuvim, has Ruth, Psalms, except Psalms is supposed to be first, but Ruth, Psalms, Job, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, Lamentation, Daniel, Esther, Ezra, Nehemiah, Chronicles. Ezra and Nehemiah are one book, and there's only one Chronicles. Okay, and so this is the books in these different categories. I want to point out a couple differences. One, stuff that we would classify as history is just all over the place. Joshua, how is that prophecy? Judges, how is that prophecy? And then ones like Daniel, which we think is prophetic, Daniel is thrown into the writings. And so your orientation is flipped upside down, and we're like, Ezra and Nehemiah, I thought that was history. Yet it's in the writings. And so I'll talk about the significance of the order and how it's placed in just a little bit. There is a significance. The next thing we need to understand is that if you look back to our text in Luke 24, it says that he being Jesus, opened their minds to understand the scripture. I don't want us to get so academic that we abandon the spirit in our pursuit and understanding the text. This must be a venture that is undertaken prayerfully. We need to allow the Spirit to guide our understanding of the Word. It is important then that when we're going to study the Bible that we take time and we pray. And finally, from that Luke 24 text, Jesus claims that the Old Testament leads to, foreshadows, and points to him. So aside from Jesus, there's at least 3 other references. There's more, but I picked out 3 here that show this shape of the Old Testament. One is called the Wisdom of Ben Sirach. That's in the Apocrypha. Then we have the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's the Qumran community. They live like monks outside of Jerusalem. And there was the story of how they found them. There was a couple of Bedouin boys. Bedouins means they're desert dwellers. They travel a lot. There were a bunch of boys. They were playing in caves, and so they took rocks and thrown them in the caves. And then they threw a rock, and they heard a shattering sound. They were like, "Oh, we found treasure." And so the young boys wanting treasure, every boy's adventure, right? I just found treasure. They're excited. They run into the caves to find scrolls. And they're like, "Oh, well, this is disappointing." It wasn't money. It was just dusty paper. And so, but luckily they didn't destroy these papers because we found a wonderful collection of scrolls and some very old copies of the Old Testament in the process. And so, particularly books like Isaiah. And so that's I'm very happy about that. Then there was a not so much a contemporary Jesus, but he's like right before the time of Jesus. Philo of Alexandria. He was a philosopher, and he was a Platonist, and so we would have to do an off-night class on philosophy because it has definitely shaped a lot of interpretation of the Bible. I think for bad. Just my personal opinion, I think one of the worst things to ever happen to the New Testament church was Platonism. The doctrinal turns that we see in the second century, so that's the years 100 to 200, I place at the feet of Platonism. Platonism is an ideology I think that has destroyed lots of biblical thinking. And so, but we would have to ask my personal opinions about that at another time. And so, okay. So those are some other texts that attest to, or other people that attest to this, to the shape. But there's also internal evidence. You can see that it's meant to be read this way. And for the sake of time, I won't go into all the depths of it all, but I'll just point out a couple things. If you read Deuteronomy to Joshua, that connection just makes sense because it ends with, because how does Deuteronomy end? Joshua being anointed leader. And then how does Joshua begin? With him being the leader. So that's an obvious seam there. And then what's interesting, if you look at the little picture that I have here, Joshua begins with a hyperlink or a connection with Psalms, because it says to meditate day and night on the law. Where do we see that at? Psalms 1. Psalms 1 and 3. You know, well, Psalms 1, verse 2 and 3, right? So we see that connection there. And then the end of Deuteronomy, which is the end of the Torah, has a literary connection with the last book of the prophets, which is Malachi. Talk about this future prophetic leader who's going to do A, B, and C. And so there's these connections and strategic points to end and round out the stories. And so the whole purpose of this section is that we can even see, it's called intertextual evidence or literary evidence, even in how the books are written, that there's some shape that's supposed to be had. You could get really detailed with this, but I don't want to do that because it'd get real dry. It'd get real dry to get into the minutia of all of that. But there's a book that I recommend. It's a dry book, but it's a good one. It's good, but it's a bit dry. It's called The Pentateuch as Narrative by John Sailhammer. The Pentateuch as Narrative by John Sailhammer. An incredible book. If all you ever, it's a book and a commentary on the whole first 5 books. Even if you never read the commentary, you just read the introduction, which is a lengthy introduction. It's about 70, 80 pages. But it's full of gold. You will be blessed tremendously by it. Okay, I want to talk a bit about the significance of these divisions and what we can take away from them. And so we have, let's say, the Torah, Nevi'im. I'll just put Nevi, and Ketuvim. Oh, you want to hear an interesting fact? Anybody, video game nerds here? Anybody play Legend of Zelda? Anybody? Ever play the really old ones like Ocarina of Time? There's a fairy called Navi that helps you, lead you through the game and tell you how to play. Navi is the Hebrew word for prophet, and prophet's guide. And so that's a little fun fact. So they name the one who helps guide you is the Hebrew word for prophet. The word Nevi'im is plural prophets, but a singular prophet is called Navi, like navigation. All right? It's guiding you. So fun little thing there. Fun for me. Not for anybody else, that's fine. I could write all this out, but I do have the notes, so I'm going to spare myself a little bit of writing. But just to kind of point out kind of where we are in the notes here with a visual representation. So when we think about the Torah, we have to keep in mind what the Torah is doing. Now, I want to pause. I've been ranting for about 35 minutes now, and I don't want to lose you folks. Okay, I want to encourage us to why we're having this Bible study again. Keep you encouraged. The goal of this is I want you folks to have all the information that's in my brain that helps me interpret the text. I'm dispensing and giving that to you. That way, you can interpret the text well. If you figure this stuff out and you get this stuff, you won't have to ask me how to do it, because then you'll know how to do it. That's the goal. I'm working myself out of a job is the goal. And so, just perspective. I don't want the church dependent on me as a pastor. That's how you become a cult. When everybody's dependent on me and I'm the only one that can interpret the text, I become Joseph Smith. And so I don't want to have a special interpretation. I want to give you all the resources and all the tools and all the references that I use so we can all study together. And so that's what this is for. This is for your protection. Okay. Like, you make the church cult proof if we all know how to study it. So there we go. That's why we're doing this. Okay. When we think about the Torah does many things. What does the word Torah mean? That's the most common definition. There's a better definition, but it wouldn't be wrong. If you translated that, nobody would fault you. You wouldn't get a mark off your grade. Instructions. We think of the word law because we see the Decalogue, right? The 10 Commandments or the 10 sayings. Or we see the priestly codes, and we see all the covenant codes, and we see, hey, don't make metal into the shape of animals. And so we think laws, but that's only a portion of the text. And so really it's a more like instruction. So what are we being instructed about? Is a way to think about it. And the Torah is instructing us about how the world got here, why things are the way they are, and where do I go from this point? That's what the Torah is about. It's supposed to provide you with the fundamentals of where did this all come from, why are things are the way they are today, and how do I move forward? That's the purpose of the Torah. It's instructions. Because you can imagine that Moses is teaching you this, and let's say it's Deuteronomy, and you're being taught Deuteronomy for the first time, and you've just got done walking in a hot desert for 40 years, and your parents just died. And now you're sitting in what we will call Jordan today. You're in a field in Jordan, and there's a river that you have to cross and go to this land, and you have to fight for years to take and conquer land. You might be wondering, how do we end up in this situation? I mean, if you're a thinking person, you would. And why do I have to fight these battles? Why did I have to watch my parents die in the desert? Why did Moses cause snakes to come out of nowhere and kill us? Why did the ground open up and take these people's lives? Why did we have to eat this yucky manna every day? We got tired of it. Why don't we do that? Why did Moses strike the rock and water come out of it? Matter of fact, why is there water up there and there's no water here, and there's day and night? What's with all this and seasons? And you want to make sense of your situation. And why did my people be enslaved for 400 years? That's a long time to be enslaved. Why did that happen? You have a lot of questions. Why don't we have a home? All the nations around me, they have a place that they call their own, but why don't we? Start wondering, who am I? And I guess I serve the God of my father, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Well, who are they? What if we're a people? What is our identity? Are they quite the Israelites yet? They don't have a border. They don't have a nation. So who are they? These are questions that we're supposed to answer the Torah. Then we have the prophets. This was probably the biggest revelation of all three of these that I received, is I could not square in my mind why the heck Joshua or Judges was considered prophecy. It did not make sense to me. I said, this is stupid. And I concluded that ancient people are dumb. Until I had to meditate and pray and realize, no, I'm dumb, and they have a very incredible way of viewing the world. What is prophecy? I think that's a very modern definition. I think that's useful, right? It's we're telling about what's going to happen and unveiling the realities of today, right? I think of prophecy. I think a helpful definition of prophecy is speaking on behalf of God. In the Old Testament, prophecy is simply speaking on behalf of God. So if that's what prophecy is, and these are stories of history, then what we have in Joshua or Judges are history told from God's perspective. And to me, that is incredible. You get to meditate and think about, what does God think about history, and what things does he find important? Because if you can figure that out, that means, what things should I bring my attention to today? We see that throughout the text. I'll give you an example from the kings, right? Think about the kings of the northern or the southern tribe. Who are some of the kings that are talked about a lot in the Bible? Name a couple. David, Ahab, talk about a whole lot. Jehu, right? Hezekiah, a couple of these ones, right? So you have different ones that are talked about quite a bit. Interestingly, if you look at other nations and the kings that they wrote the most about, guess who's one of the kings that they wrote the most about? Omri. The Bible gives very little attention to Omri. You probably don't know much about Omri. I wouldn't either, because God didn't talk much about him. But all the other nations talked a lot about Omri because he was a good king. Not religiously good, but he was an effective administrator. And Israel thrived under his leadership. They got very wealthy, and it took a lot of land. And he was the guy that established the capital city of Samaria. And so when you look at the text from like Assyria or Babylon, they call the kings of Israel from the house of Omri. So, but that's not what God focused on. He focused on Ahab. Why? Or he talked about Manasseh a lot, because these were really wicked kings. God was much more concerned about morality than he was about military success. So you get to, when you think about it this way, you get a sneak peek into God's perspective and his priorities. God is much more concerned with the morality of a king than his effectiveness as a military leader. So then, right, we start thinking about, in our politics, I've heard so many Christians say, especially if you're a traditional Christian or you're a Christian with conservative or you're socially conservative, they'll say, oh, but, you know, Trump's not the best, but, you know, he's the lesser of two evils. And we'll have all these opinions about Trump and all those different things. But in God's mind, does the success of a nation, is that good enough? What is he concerned with? Because the Bible says that God sets up all kings and he tears down all kings. Elisha anointed the king of Damascus. His name was Rezin. He anointed him to be king. God sets up kings and he tears them down. And so he's not just concerned with their efficacy as a political leader. He wants to make sure that these are good people. And if they're not, they can bring judgment on a nation. Now, that's not to suggest that God can't use wicked people, because he certainly does. right? And so I'm not swaying you to vote one way or another. Just that when we're having our political conversations, just recognize that you're having a political conversation and not a religious one, and make a clear distinction between the two. I think that'd be helpful. Right? We got to make sure. I don't want us to put God's values. I don't want us to put value on things and then throw God's sticker of approval on it when He probably doesn't have it up there. That's weird. Now, I don't have any problem admitting this. I'm personally conservative, and so I tend to vote that way. And so I have nothing against him particularly. I'm just saying, you're just not going to hear me say, this is God's man. I'm a conservative, and I vote this way. It's much more that. It's my personal ideas of meditations on politics and how political philosophy, my study of history, I've come to this conclusion. I'm not going to say, well, God made me vote this way. Maybe not. So let's not do that. Okay. Rabbit trail. Let's come back. Okay. And the writings. I think a wonderful way to think about the writings is two ways. One, commentary on the older books of the Bible. You get to figure out, okay, if you want to know how to interpret Genesis or Exodus or Samuel or Kings, read the Psalms. The Psalms will teach you, or read any of these books that make references to earlier parts of the Bible. They're giving commentary on the earlier parts of the Bible, and you can learn how they interpreted the text. Anything in the writings is basically a commentary for us to look for earlier parts. That's one way to think about it. But two, it's wisdom for living outside the promised land. So a lot of this stuff takes place post-exilic. I mean, they've already been exiled, and maybe they're returned, or some people haven't returned yet. So it's how do I live for God when my world is falling apart? How do I live for God when I'm surrounded by immorality on all sides? How do I pick up the mess of my life and try to be a person of God after everybody around me has failed me? And I'm in a very difficult situation that's not very pleasant. How do I live for God now? That's what these letters are good for. They'll help you think about those things. How do I worship God without a temple? And so, I think that'll be a helpful way to think about some of these texts. But now, I don't want there to be so much, oh boy, 12 minutes, huh? That's all I have left. I'm only on point 1. I have 3 points. No. Okay. I don't want there to be so much disunity from these 3 sections. They are one mega collection. They all kind of come together. And so I want to point something out to you. Yeah, I'm not going to be able to finish beyond point 1, so I'm just going to stop it with, I'll finish point 1 and then we'll call it quits there. Okay. Okay, so if you think about the Tanakh, basically from Genesis through Kings, you have the entire history of the people of Israel. And so if you want to, you know how the preachers, they're preaching and they quote an Old Testament story. If you want to get like 90% of them, you need to have read Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings. That's the vast majority of the history of Israel up until their exile. If you get that, that's most of the history. Then there's some books that take place a little bit later in time, right? And there's some that are interspersed, like Ruth would be during the time of Judges, but Ruth is doing something very different. Or then there's some that are post-exilic, so it's after the exile, so like Ezra, Nehemiah, Daniel, and Esther, different ones like that. And so, but the main narrative is from Genesis to Kings, so that's a united story. And so, I saw something interesting. You could think about the Tanakh in another way. Man, I should have got a bigger napkin. That's not effective or efficient. let's say you have Nevi'im, right? We have narrative. We have a ton of prophecy writings. And then we have some more narrative. Because it ends, because the last book of the Ketuvim is Chronicles, right? And so if you look at the structure of the Old Testament, is narratives on the outside with prophetic writing, prophecy and commentary on the inside. I actually don't have a rationale for that, but I think it's worth thinking about. Why would God structure the Old Testament that way? So narrative, prophecy writing, narrative. I'm trying to teach you how to think about the Bible. So it was arranged this way intentionally, and the way it was arranged communicates a message. I don't have an answer because I haven't thought about it. I'm going to think with you. We'll come something together. What message can be communicated from arranging the Bible this way? Narrative, speeches, narrative. Okay. Okay. You're right. Let's get the ball rolling. Okay. This is me thinking in real time. So, okay. So we could say that there's narrative on the outside with prophecy and writing in the middle. And so what's in the middle, it wants to draw your attention to, right? So like a literary device is like a chiasm, you could say. So it's drawing your attention to the middle. Well, what's most of the prophecy about? It's judgment, and then it's hope. Hope for what? So maybe this structure is supposed to focus the text on our forward hope. Maybe that's a way that they want. When you think about this collection, the heart of the collection is forward facing toward the Messiah. So maybe they arranged it this way to produce a messianic hope. So that's a possible idea. Another way you could think about it, all right, so if that's a central thing, then the outer narratives bring meaning to the middle. So what are these stories, right? You could say the reason why we need this messianic hope is because of the stories on the outside. And so you could say we have these stories of the perpetual failure of man. And this other narrative, Chronicles, is the inability of even the anointed line to bring about salvation for the people of Israel. So what we need a true anointed representative that can fix the fallenness of the narratives before, and that's what the messianic hope is about. So. But so that's good. What you're identifying is maybe it could be that the author is trying to draw our attention somewhere. Because if all you had is a narrative, it's pretty hopeless. It's a hopeless story. There's not much good in these stories. They all end bad. But the main message that the Tanakh communicates, the main message is, yeah, everything's kind of messy. Everything's really kind of falling apart. And all the people around you, they kind of suck. But there's coming a one who can take care of the mess that you see around you. and can transform the people that you see all around you. And that is our awaited hope. It's the meat. This is the, you can say, the main attraction. The main attraction is not to make everything else irrelevant, but it's that messianic figure. That is what we're putting our hope in. And so my guess would be something with what we're saying here. I think that's probably the meaning of this. It would be something toward drawing our attention to that messianic figure. Well, yeah, except for my toddler does. But aside from people who don't understand, people with understanding, that you want the protein, right, and the nutrients. And so I have 5 minutes and then 2 concepts that I want to talk about. And so how am I going to do that? With great speed. One is, if you've been with me for a couple years, you've heard me say this. So that's Genesis 1 through 11 is the fancy word is prolegomena. It's the prologue of the Bible. If you want to understand the Bible, you need to understand the Old Testament. But if there's any part of the Old Testament that you need to have basically internalized and memorized, it's the first 11 chapters of Genesis. All of the major plot points of the Bible through the New Testament, all of the major plot points trace back to those chapters. The vast majority of the symbolism that you see in the biblical text goes back to those first 11 chapters. Most of the theological root of most of the doctrines and ideas that we talk about have their root in Genesis 1 through 11. There's a set of narrative cycles that we see on repeat throughout those first 11 chapters that we see repeated over and over and over. For example, the concept of God sets you up in this situation, things are going well, then you have a moment of testing, you fail the test, and then you're put outside of the presence of God, and then you have another test set before you, and you fail that test, and then so it's a cycles of you're being tested to trust God, you fail to do it, and things get progressively worse. And then you're tested to trust God, and then you fail the test, and then things get progressively worse. That's Judges. That's Samuel. That's Kings. That's the story. It's the story of the patriarchs. They all have a test. And what you'll see even this will be so much minutia. Even the words that are used in the Bible, in those first 11 chapters, are used on repeat in the Hebrew, and they're supposed to clue you back in. I think one of the examples that I love the most is that who's the main antagonist in the garden? The snake, and one of the words for snake is nachash. The only reason why that matters is because the word for bronze is nechoshet, which is the same letters as bronze and the same letters as snake. What does Goliath wear? Brass armor. He's covered. It says the word bronze like 7 times in like a couple verses. It says nechoshet, nechoshet, and it says it over and over and over and over. What's interesting foreshadow. Guess what armor Saul has? Bronze is the same one. Guess what David refuses to wear? Snaky armor. It's Genesis over and over and over. What test does David fail? He saw something good and he took it. Genesis 1 through 11 is the whole Bible on repeat. Okay. It's the whole Bible on repeat over. Or what's another big one is Cain and Abel. That's brothers fighting. What is Joseph's story? Brothers fighting. Going into the land, all the ites, they're all cousins. They're brothers fighting. The northern kingdom versus the southern kingdom, brothers fighting. Those first 11 chapters is the whole Bible on repeat. Okay. And I'm out of time. I'll save this for when we'll talk about in the future. There's a concept called Deuteronomistic history. We'll have to explore that concept at another time. But basically, it's the idea, very generally, that Deuteronomy is the linchpin for how to read Joshua, Judges, King, and Samuel. Or Samuel and King. You can't read those books and make sense of them without Deuteronomy. And I'll show those connections as we press on in this lesson. So I'm going to stop here. This was supposed to be a 20-minute discussion. It lasted for an hour. That was one point. I had 3. So this is going to be a little bit longer than I thought. But hopefully there's some things that were shared today that's going to be helpful for your journey in studying the Bible. So I want to stop for questions. If there's any questions, anything you want clarified, I want to take time to do that. And then we'll set out a time that we're going to start to pray. Yes? Oh, 100% Genesis. If I were teaching somebody who's a Christian to read the Bible, I would read, in order, I'd read these books. Genesis, Exodus, the first 9 chapters of Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Judges, Samuel, Kings, and then I go to the New Testament. That's what I would do. I would do that. And when I went to the New Testament, I would read Luke first, then Acts, and then everything else. After that, you can start mixing it up. But that's how I would read it. And just tell them the wait is okay. We do get to Jesus. But we get to Jesus, and really, to be fair, I'm skipping out a whole lot. You cannot understand the New Testament without Isaiah. The writers of the New Testament, so you're going to read Paul's stuff. Before you get to Paul's stuff, you need to read Isaiah. He just copy and paste from Isaiah like all the time. Jesus does too. His parables, he copy and paste Isaiah. Like, small example, the armor of God, Paul did not create that. He took that from Isaiah. Armor of God's in Isaiah. I thought Paul was the most brilliant. He is a literary genius. Don't get it twisted. I'm like, yo, how did he come up with this concept? And he got it from Isaiah. That's where he got it from. So you cannot understand Paul without reading Isaiah. So I would do all that, read Isaiah, and then hop back to Paul's letters. Yeah. I would read them in that order. The one I read earlier. Let me fact check that list to make sure it's correct. Yeah, Psalms is first, and the first prophet is actually Isaiah, not Jeremiah. Mm-hmm. Oh, they debate about the order of that one. So that's a whole debate in of itself. So I could tell you which one's probably more fun to read. Jonah's fun to read. So Jonah's fun to read. Amos is really useful. You would probably want to read Amos. Zechariah is very useful for lots of things. So there's some that kind of stand out more than others. Right? So I would read Malachi probably. There's a couple ones. There's certain of the minor prophets that really stand out. So I would maybe put attention toward those. Yes. So it's, I wish I brought my Bible with me. I have a Bible that's in Hebrew. So when you're reading the Hebrew Bible, so you look backwards, and then you, like this, right to left. So if you're reading it with me, you read like this. Let's say that 2 columns, then you go to the next column here and read like this. Yeah, so everything is that way. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So it's an adjustment, but you get used to it. It's really not that hard. Between Greek and Hebrew, Hebrew is definitely harder. Greek is a much easier language. It's more familiar, right? Like if I said the word to you in Greek, nekros, you could probably figure out what that means. Anybody? Nekros? Huh? No. Let's say if you like fantasy, necros. Yes, right. So necros means death, right? Or another one, thanatos means death. Thanatos. So some of these words make more sense to us. The Greek is closer to us than Hebrew. Hebrew's so far away. There's just no relation. But then there's some that are just so far away that like you would never associate them with each other. Like I don't know, like Haris being grace or something, or Dorea being gift. You would never make those connections. So, yes. Any other questions? I love questions. Any other questions? Burning in your heart. Yes. Yes. I actually get into this a little bit next week. I'm of the opinion that you interpret the Bible like a piece of literature. And the example that I normally give is if you want to read The Great Gatsby, you have to know something about American history at a very particular time. And there's a set of vocabulary that you need to know to read The Great Gatsby. The same thing is true for the Bible. So if you're going to read the Old Testament, you should know about the late Bronze Age and the Iron Age, what's happening in the ancient Near East in the Bronze and Iron Age. If you don't, you're missing a lot. It just makes it difficult to understand. I don't know, pick any ancient book, or just go back to high school English. Any of those books that we read, if you don't know the history around the book, you don't know the book. This is another exercise that I give. If I paid you $1,000, I was going to. I said, "Do teach me for an hour on Shakespeare, and you just do a good job. But I'll give you $1,000, but I have to rate your teaching as good." You are going to study all sorts of things so you can teach this class well, right? Those things that you would look up to teach Shakespeare, or if you want to read Dante's The Divine Comedy by Dante, like there's things that you would have to know about Italy in the 1400s. It's the same thing with the Bible. So I treat it like literature. If you treat it like literature, you'll interpret it well. Yes. Which feels sacrilegious for some people, but the same on the record, the way you would read Homer's Odyssey is the same way and the same skills to read the Bible. Same skills. No difference. Yes. So what you do is my recommendation is start conservative and then go liberal. Is what is my recommendation. Start conservative so you have a safe foundation, and liberal so you can get another perspective. So if I'm studying history, right, I'm going to find a scholar who's the words you want to look for a scholar of anything in the Bible is called evangelical. You want an evangelical scholar. That's where you start. So I pick any topic and I Google evangelical scholar on this topic. That will give me a foundation. That means they believe that the Bible is the inspired word of God, and they believe in the historicity, and it's conservative. And once I understand all the major terminology, then I look up just scholarship on this. And you'll have guys who are completely atheists just talking about the Bible. But they're treating it academically, and that can be useful. But I wouldn't start there, because then you might learn yourself out of understanding the text. And so, right, if you want to, like, let's say you want to learn about how the Bible was composed or the origin of the Bible, I wouldn't look at Wellhausen. I would look at Ezekiel Kaufman, right? One's a conservative Italian gentleman, but one's a liberal German guy, right? Wellhausen is very liberal, but Kaufman is very conservative. Yes, yes, yes. So that's kind of what I do. Any other questions? Please ask questions. I want you to have understanding. We're still going to stop prayer at 9 no matter what. So this is not adding time for tonight. We're going to stop at the same time. It's okay. Any other questions? Matthew's thinking about it. Go ahead, just ask the question. It's okay. When prayer starts, all the people who are going to leave are going to leave anyway, so it's okay. It's okay. Go ahead. I like the Old Testament more than the New Testament. 100%. 100%. It's more interesting. So, so we're talking about building knowledge about the Bible, or just general knowledge. Generally, what sort of knowledge? Knowledge is vague. What type of knowledge? Okay, so I think the sort of question you're talking about is a matter of what's called biblical theology. It's, let's say there's an idea that you want to understand. You want to trace that idea from the beginning of the book to the end. That's what I would do. So let's say I want to learn about grace. You can't start in the Testament. Start in the Old Testament and work your way through. And so look at grace in the Old Testament, how it functions, and work with the New Testament. That's biblical theology. Instead of just doing a word study, which is, here's the word grace in the New Testament, because I Googled it, and I read all the scriptures, and now I understand grace. No, you don't. You know nothing about grace. You think you do, but you don't. And so something like that. As far as just like wisdom and meditation, well, the Old Testament has lots of wisdom literature, Proverbs and Psalms and Job, things like that. So, yes. Anybody else? I could do this all night. All right. Well, thank you, folks, for joining us. One of these days, I want to devote the hour to just questions. I think that'd be helpful too. But I want to stop here. Thank you, folks. So it's time is now